to talk a little bit about shadows. I love shadows. They have become for me very organic. That's the only word I can think of. I guess in the beginning I thought of them as fixed. I thought of them as very stable shapes, and they aren't really. Shadows are a cast shadow now. I should clarify that. A cast shadow is what you see on this white surface because the light source is over here. It's hitting this object and it's casting a shadow on the paper. Core shadow is what you see on the item, but we won't be talking about that today. What I'll be talking about is the cast shadows. And the reason I say they're organic is because it depends upon where the light source is coming from, and then how strong it is. It depends upon a lot of other elements. For instance, these are what I would call quite soft shadows. But if I give a more intense light, then we get these very sharp shadows. We also get cast shadows in another direction because I have two different lights here. So a shadow is not always a shadow, is not always a shadow, is not always a shadow. And if you know the poem, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. I think there's a reason why the poet writes about the shadow as though it's a separate thing, independent of the object that it is next to, and that's not really true, but they behave that way because the light changes. Or if you remember in the movie Peter Pan, where Peter Pan has lost his shadow and asks Wendy to sew it back on for him. That is anthropomorphizing, so to speak, the shadow. So when we work with it in two-dimensional art, it's good to keep that in mind, that they can change, and that using the shadow in our artwork to make a lively and life-looking scene takes a little bit of thought. Now, for instance, this is a photograph I took of my niece working on the beach. And if you notice, this shadow is very sharp-edged and it's very dark. And when I did a pastel of this, when I first did it, I followed this exactly, and I made these edges very sharp, and I made it very dark. And it looked like an oil slick or some black creepy thing. It didn't look like a shadow, it didn't function as a shadow. And that's often what happens when we take a photograph and we use that photograph for reference. When it comes to shadows, a number of things, especially when it comes to shadows, we have to remember that that's the way the camera has captured it. It's not necessarily the way we see it. So when as I worked on the pastel, this is the pastel painting, I softened those edges. You can see how irregular, that's what I mean by soften, those edges are. And I didn't put any black in the shadow. I stuck to blues and complementary colors to get the darkness. And I could tell that there was a luminosity because it was wet. She was dripping from being in the water. And so I wanted to pick up on that luminosity as well. So the shadow that I painted is quite different from my photo reference, but by observing people on the beach and in actual daylight and watching what those shadows did, I was able to alter it in the painting to make it more lifelike. Now, the other thing about shadows is when they are sharpest, most distinct that is, and darkest, close to the object. This is very important to remember. And as it gets away from the object, it's much lighter, and much more indistinct. The edges are what I call soft, or meaning there's no sharp delineation between the light background and the tone of the shadow. So darkest next to the item, fading away, and even within this it comes and goes. Here it's a little softer than along here, because right in between here is it's a little further away from the jack. And if, as I showed in the pastel of the little girl, if we do those shadows very sharp, this is a photograph I took with the very sharp light, if we actually render it that way, it looks like a separate object. It doesn't function as its shadow. It functions as maybe there's a black spot on the table. I don't know if I can demonstrate that. I probably can. I'll do it. And in color, it's the same way. You just, you would be using color, different colors to get those soft edges and so forth. So if I'll use this color, I have a very faint line on here to indicate where I'm going with the shadow. So if I were to very intensely color it in, and this would take me a while, so I probably won't continue this for, well, maybe I can. I think you'll notice how much unlike a shadow it functions. I'm copying what I'm seeing there, but translated into, and I know that that's real because I took the photograph, but not all photographs as they are translate into rendering it with the art materials that way. So that just functions as another shape. Whereas if I follow the appearance of, now I've lost it, here we go, how this shape comes and goes in its intensity, darker close to the object, so darker wherever that object is laying on the table, and lighter as it gets away. Now this, it takes a little bit of time, and I'm not going to take that time here, but I do have a time-lapse video after this one on YouTube, so if you want to see it actually filled in, you can go to that. This is also a good exercise in even that much functions better as a shadow. This is a good exercise for practicing values. This is a 1 to 10 value, this being the lightest, this being the darkest, and then the 9 increments in between. And it is possible to get that with graphite, even an even colored pencil. You can buy graded images like this, or you can create your own and then just use them as a guide. And they can come in handy because you can hold them up to, for instance, a photograph and try and figure out, try and match what you're seeing there. So this is about a, way out at the end of that is about a 10% tone. So that's not much tone being put down. And then close to the object is about a 10, or maybe even a 9 would be closer. So this is a good skill to always be practicing. And shadows are a great exercise in learning to see those grades and learning to put them down.